Good morning, everybody. It's good to see everybody this morning. Hope you're enjoying it. We are in our third session in our series of worship that pleases God. In session one, when we started off, we were reflecting on the question of how can I balance private and communal worship. And if you remember, we looked at both in Mark and also in Hebrews, specifically around Mark, we have the example of Christ and the reminder that in our worship, it does involve us to separate ourselves in some way, to come and commune with God personally. But then from Hebrews, we also talked about the importance of being connected to the community of faith and how important that is in our faith journey and when we seek to worship God collectively. And that in that space of being together as a people of God, that we are connected into that hope and that reassurance that God is with us and that hope of God eternal as we move forward. Last week, then we looked at penitence and not pride with when we are to humble ourselves before God. Remember, it was the parable that Jesus spoke of the comparison between the Pharisee and the tax collector. And I think as we walked through that last week, it was a reminder that we have a little bit of both probably in our own lives, that we can hold on to some things that it's easy sometimes not to be humble coming before God. But it was a reminder, as we walked away with that our hearts of humility and going before God and in our worship is that attitude matters. Today, we're going to continue the discussion and talk about others, not self. And today we're looking at the church in Corinth. And Paul's letter specifically in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 is what we'll be looking at. So we'll be looking at chapter 14, 15 through 17, and then 21 through 33. And the question that we're posed here is, what do I contribute to the church's worship? So it's an odd piece of scripture that probably prompts this question, to be quite honest, but it is one in which we are taking a look at Paul's writing to and support for the church in the early church in the midst of a lot of struggle, a lot of diversity that was going on culturally that the church was working in, everything from being a city that was under a Roman colony that also had Greek influence both in its language and its culture, a mix of different religions in Corinth, as well as being a city, a high commerce city. So a lot of folks coming in to the city that created this kind of little bit, and the authors kind of talk about it being chaotic, but I can imagine it's very much of a kind of a community, which is very vibrant, very changing, and a lot of mixing attitudes. And it's something probably we can relate to today. Oftentimes when we think about communities, especially transient communities or those that have more folks visiting and so forth, you have a lot of diversity, a lot of different thoughts. And so you can imagine that, and that the church is absorbing some of that. So as people obviously live in community, coming together as a community, as people of faith, but they themselves are trying to figure out how do we live counterculture to that and live out the life of Christ. And so you see that Paul is writing back to them probably in response to the questions that they had for him after being there for many years or many months, 18 months or so. They really had a very close relationship with Paul. And so even though they don't always agree with each other, sometimes you have Paul that then is writing to them, trying to encourage them. And so we pick that up in chapter 14, specifically around the great fun topic of speaking in tongues. And so I think that I don't know how much of the speaking in tongues stuff we need to debate this morning, but it'd be interesting with that. But I think the main part that we're coming at is how do we use the gifts that God has given us, and what is the attitude that we bring into worship? And I would even say is, what is that attitude individually, but collectively that we're trying to do when we're trying to be united, inclusive in this diversity? In some ways, that's a lot of what Paul is trying to get out of the church, or trying to instruct the church. And so it becomes a lesson, I think, for us as we look at this chapter of how we can live and how we can worship and create a sense of unity even in the midst of diversity, unity in Christ as we go through it. So that's kind of the highlight of what we're going to be looking at today. There'll be a couple points that we'll try to pull out as we go into this, but it's really an appeal, I think, for Paul to try to have this agreement, no division, and I think you'll see that as we read today's scripture. Does somebody want to start us off and look at 1 Corinthians chapter 14, 15 through 17, 21 through 33 and read that for us?
I can read it.
Okay, Jerry's going to read it for us. Thank you, Jerry.
What should I do then? I will pray with the spirit, but I will pray with the mind also. I will sing praise with the spirit, but I will sing praise with the mind also. Otherwise, if you say a blessing with the spirit, how can anyone in the position of an outsider say the amen to your thanksgiving, since the outsider does not know what you're saying? For you may give thanks well enough, but the other person is not built up. In the law it is written, by people of strange tongues and by the lips of foreigners, I will speak to the people. Yet even then, they will not listen to me, says the Lord. Tongues then are a sign, not for believers, but for unbelievers, while prophecy is not for unbelievers, but for believers. If therefore the whole church comes together and all speak in tongues, and outsiders or unbelievers enter, will they not say that you're out of your mind? But if all prophecy, an unbeliever or an outsider who enters is reproved by all and called to account by all, after the secrets of the unbeliever's heart are disclosed, that person will bow down before God and worship him, saying, declaring, God is really among you. What should be done then, my friends? When you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up. If anyone speaks in a tongue, let there be only two, at most three, and each in turn, and let one interpret. But if there is no one to interpret, then let them be silent in church and speak to themselves and to God. Let two or three prophets speak, and let the others weigh what is said. If a revelation is made to someone else sitting nearby, let the first person be silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and all be encouraged. And the spirits of prophets are subject to the prophets. For God is a God, not of disorder, but of peace.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So let's start a conversation. I want you to pause just for a moment and just think about worship. Think about your experience, and it could be at Southside, it could be from your previous experience or something, just in your own faith journey. Just think for a minute as you think about worship specifically. Think of that. What is something out of worship that is meaningful to you? What is the most meaningful part of worship to you? And why? And as you have that in your head, you probably identify what's the most meaningful thing for you in worship. What makes it meaningful to you? And how would it feel if it wasn't a part of your worship experience?
Prayer is probably one of the most important things to me in worship. And I recently went to a funeral where I was shocked. The entire funeral was conducted, and there was never a prayer offered. I had never heard that before in my life, and I left very unnerved that a service could have been conducted to someone and there was no prayer. So prayer is so important to me.
Rusty, when you added the second question of if it were missing, music, and especially songs that were from either childhood experiences or important times, if that makes sense, like a camp song or a song at our wedding or my sister's wedding. They bring back memories, I guess. Music especially Cheryl's piece, Jesus paid it all. I told her how that just was wonderful
Mhm.
and worshipful.
Rusty, I would say the message, and we're fortunate that we have such talented people, Dr. Kelly, and when he's out, others, and Ethan that can speak to us. And that it's that time when we just, at least for me, where you just shut out everything. And whatever you're going through in life, and you focus and you know there's hope.
You know you're not alone.
I would say it's kind of all of that. It's hard for me to pick one thing because I love the music and I also love the pastoral prayer that Tim does, and the message. So I think for me, it's all three of those things that make a complete worship experience.
Mhm.
Tim, don't get a complex. Nobody said the message first. I was thinking that.
I wasn't getting a complex. I was thinking that's the least for me, because it's more the people that are there that makes an experience for me, because from my perspective, being able to look out and see the different ones. And as I've mentioned before, some prayers and all that, I do try to think about the different people that are going to be there beforehand and imagine what everybody, just like looking around at all the screen now, knowing the different issues that some of you are dealing with and the family concerns you have, all those things that are weighing heavy on you. That's to me what makes worship really special.
That Tim reminded me of something that I've noted after COVID. The person bringing the message interacts much more with the congregation. There's not like a wall. Before it was more formal to me, like Tim will call out somebody's name, or we're glad to see so and so. That just, I don't know. I like that. And when Tim mentioned the people, that reminded me of what I've noted. A positive of COVID.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I don't think that every Sunday it's the same thing, that, it's kind of, sometimes you go in and maybe it is a beautiful musical piece that speaks to you more than anything. Sometimes it's a sermon, sometimes it's, sometimes it's something that somebody else who's there says to you. Beautiful flowers. Sometimes there's been times when looking at those flowers and just thinking how beautiful they are, and that's what God created. There's been times when that was one of the most meaningful things. So it's but sometimes it depends on your own mind. Sometimes you try to quieten your mind, but sometimes maybe you're not focused, you're not getting what the speaker's saying as good as other times. And it's just, I don't think it's the same thing every week for me. Sometimes it's this and sometimes it's that.
Aren't they all elements of reaching out? I mean, we reach out in prayer, we reach out in music, we reach out with the homily, we reach out when we greet each other in church. I'm glad that we have the Zoom church service, but now that we're getting more people, I think our collective worship is a good thing where we're all together in the sanctuary now. That's my post-COVID thought, I suppose.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you for all of that. It's great things. I think overwhelmingly, I think everything that you're mentioning, from the music to the atmosphere and the way the offerings that are offered, whether they're through presence or prayer or through the, flowers or other things. Ultimately, it's creating a space in which, one, I think we gather as people of God, that we come together as one, saying that's meaningful to be in the same space together, to be in that space, and that hopefully through that experience of worship, as we direct our attention and our praise to God, that we are uplifted as the people of God too, that we are coming together, and that worship becomes a central part of our faith journey, in the sense that we are reminded of that hope, we're reminded of that presence of God within our lives, and that's our offering back to God in that worship. There are things that can distort that, and Carl mentioned one thing. We can come in and not have that mindset, right? Some of it is our own mindset, it's the offering that we come in our own hearts to be ready. Are there other things that sometimes can disrupt, if you will, the experience of worship that can draw us away perhaps of our focus on God, who is the author and the perfecter of our faith? So are there things that may draw us away that in that time, in that space, besides ourselves sometimes?
Well, it can be the attitude perhaps of, we read the book Searching for Sunday. What was her name? Rachel Evans, Rachel. But anyway, she writes about, I think it was her church and in Tennessee, and they had these signs out against LGBTQ, or some kind of vote that was coming up. And the church had put out negative signs about that. And, she said, talking about, she saw the signs and they just kept right on going. And I think a lot of times we bring our biases or our dislike into a church service. I mean, what if Jesus had gone up to the woman at the well, you dirty such and such, what are you doing sleeping with all these men? She never would have been anything, she never would have seen anything about him that was good. And I think a lot of times we can bring our anti-beliefs, anti-love, dislove of people into a church service. And I think when we do that, we drive people away.
That's why Marilyn needs to give her talk on Wednesday night. Yeah, that's very good, Marilyn. I remember we lived in Tennessee quite a while, and Howard Baker once said, there's a time for learning, a time for earning, and a time for returning. I think he was speaking more in terms of when you probably retired, time for you to spend more time returning. But we as believers in our church, we know and we realize that returning takes place from the very beginning. We never, and that's a reminder that we have, that we here at our church in the worship service, that it's not just about receiving, it's about giving, and that's where we are blessed and others are blessed. And that giving is also what Marilyn just said, understanding who we should be, and learning and overcoming any kind of biases that we have that are not what Christ wants us to be. And sometimes we have to overcome our heritage, what we've grown up with, and maybe what we've been taught either through our families or through the community or just through life's experiences that are not correct. So thank you for Marilyn for saying that.
Definitely.
Thank you.
No, go ahead, Marilyn.
I was just gonna say, my mother told me, a few years ago, I guess maybe it was when the right to marriage was passed, but she was telling me about a conversation she had with a young lady who who went to the church that I grew up in. And of course, my mother in her older years, she wasn't able to go, but the lady would stop and pick up her mail and stuff for her. So they had this conversation, and the lady asked her, her name was Miko, and she asked her, what my mother thought about perhaps gay people coming to church and if she thought that was okay. And I imagine, that my mother never really thought about that. You know what I mean? Most people just don't think about, if it's not you, not your, I guess, problem or thing to think about, you don't think about it. And my mother said, she was like, I reckon it's okay. She said, I don't see where Jesus would say anybody cannot come in the church. And I just thought, here's this 80-something-year-old woman who's just not really an advocate for anything, but who has this sense of that Jesus loves people, my love or your love or our love may not be perfect, but just to have this sense of who God is, what he's called you to do, even if it's not always on your mind, but yet, God calls you to love, and that's who the church is. And that's what we have to give out to other people. Paul's talking about a divisive community and speaking in tongues, or a diverse community. But his whole message in that is not to be divisive. It's what can you do to bring people in? And I think that's a powerful message for us today.
That's exactly, I think it's interesting is if you look at the beginning of 1 Corinthians in chapter 1, verse 10, he appeals to the church and says, I appeal to you to be in agreement that there's no division, that you're united in the same mind and the same purpose. And that's the kind of the vision of the letter, I think, when it first starts out, is this idea, is this call as a people of faith, as a church, as people of God, to come together in recognizing that division, but come to God, come united in that same mind and the same purpose. I think that's a path that we have tried to even follow here at Southside. And we know, even from our own experience, how difficult that is for all the things we're talking about here, the individual lives that we have, the cultural things that are going on, all the things. And I think that's what makes this letter in particularly important. There's a couple points that I bring us to in this. One, I think there is a calling of Paul to balance, right? I think there's in a couple places where he says there's two extremes that we can operate, and oftentimes those extremes are easy to find when we do come and when we're diverse. In those extremes, it's easy to say, I'll go to one of those extremes. And really what Paul is trying to say, let's come to the middle. Let's come to the middle and balance. We need both, actually. It's not an either or in this. And one of the ways he says that is in our thinking and our feeling. And Tim, I had to laugh when the commentator was talking about this, but he talks about it in verse 15, and Tim and I have often had conversations around thought versus feeling. And I love Paul's approach to this. He said, you know what? It's easy in worship. And in 15, he says, what should I do then? I prayed with the Spirit, but I would pray with my mind also. And so what he's trying to do is to say, there was a feeling going on in the church is that it's easy to get wrapped up into the emotion of worship. And I think this is what he was trying to get at. There was this emotional response, and we've all been moved at certain times in worship, right? But there's also the point in the congregation what Paul was recognizing is, you know what, this is almost like all you're trying to do is hit this emotional high. You're going after this emotional high and everything, and there's this ecstasy that comes in the speaking of tongues, and you're so focused on just that feeling that you're kind of forgetting the truth around the gospel. And so remember that it kind of folds into his next statement in 16 and 17. It's like, when you do that, you're leaving people behind because people don't understand what's going on. You're not bringing them, you're not being intentional to make sure they understand this. And so balance that with the thinking and the thought. And he goes on, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but the inside outside kind of perspective. He says, in the things that we're doing in worship, in the way that we're going about this, it's great that you have the gifts of tongues. It's great that you read. He doesn't really ridicule that, but what he does say is, but let's do it in such a way, one, that people understand it. And then as we're participating in worship, let's make space so that everybody can do it. And let's take turns in a way, but let's not forget that when we gather, that we also want to hear the word. We need to be preaching the word, and prophesying is the word they use in the New Testament, is that preaching of the word and really that telling of the gospel story here. And that became, he said, let's not forget that when we come together, that's critical to what we're doing, is that people are hearing that story and that we're growing in faith around our life with Christ. And so I think he also talks a little bit about this balance in structure and spontaneity. There seemed to be a little bit of chaos coming on, and that, you know how we described the world around them that they were living in? Everything was a little bit in chaos, and kind of the way the authors were describing this is that when you came into worship, that it was kind of like, okay, who has the feeling to it today? You know, okay, you go do that, I'll do this. And then suddenly it was just the spontaneity without much plan, without much of a thoughtfulness coming into it to say, you know, today, let's plan it this way. And he's like, let's plan it a little bit better. And that also along the way, people will have an opportunity to participate. So we're sharing in this together. He's really trying to address the idea in this diversity, we're having inequality going on. There's an inequality with, there's richer members, we're trying to fight the status of different classes of people in society that are coming into the church, and some people are feeling left out. When we get into worship, we're focused on this speaking in tongues where people don't understand and people are getting left out. And then pretty soon what begins to happen is we have an othering going on in the church, that suddenly people are saying, but I came and I believe and I want to be a part of something, but I'm not being included any longer. And so those three things kind of help us to think through what Paul was talking about, this idea of balance, but also how do we make sure that in our worship, in our experience, that we're also being mindful of, are there things that we are doing, is a question we might ask ourselves, are there things that inadvertently are excluding some folks, or not being inclusive of folks, because they're not necessarily understanding and but want to be a part of the community of faith. So let's kind of break it apart, and those things that kind of conversation. This idea of balance between feelings and thoughts, the idea of balance between structure and spontaneity, how we feel about that, how we balance that, and then how do we be more intentional, as Paul talks about it, about this idea of inclusion. So where's some thoughts around that?
Well, I think what Marilyn was saying is kind of on track, but I think when you come into a church space, especially if you're a new person, you're bringing all of your history with you. So is there a feeling in the church that this is a safe space, a space where there aren't conditions on who can come in? You know, you have to believe the right doctrine, wear the right clothes, be the right sexual orientation, the right color, so that it's like nobody's excluded. And I think part of that, which is really challenging for me being an introvert, is like when new people come in, going up and introducing myself, trying to get to know them, speaking to them, making them feel welcome. I think that's a important component. And then, you know, what's said in the pulpit, you know, can make a person feel safe or unsafe. So whoever the speaker is can use their power in a way that is hurting people, or is it building people up? So those are some thoughts I had.
I'm glad we stopped at the verse we did. To go beyond that sort of gets into contentious items.
Well, that's where we are.
If Henry was here, he would say they just skipped the difficult verse. Let's talk about the difficult.
Right.
Carl wanted to go on.
Yeah, I'm glad Warren brought that up, not me.
Yeah.
But I will go say once, just, like, verses 1 through 3 of this is a good summary that, that is skipped. Sometimes I do wonder about that. So I can read it in the Message.
Yeah, please.
It says, in 14:1, go after a life of love as if life depended on it, because it does. Give yourselves to the gifts God gives you. Most of all, try to proclaim his truth. If you praise him in private language of tongues, God understands you, but no one else does. For you are sharing intimacies just between you and him. But when you proclaim his truth in everyday speech, you're letting others in on the truth so that they can grow and be strong and experience his presence with you. To me, that's kind of a little like a summary of it.
It's a summary of it, isn't it? What stands out to you most in that?
Well, I think that it's, number one, it starts off with love, and I think that's the key thing in proclaiming the truth. That's.
Yeah. The basis of it all, right there. And I think you're right. I think in essence of Paul's letter, I think he's really trying to say, yeah, the spirit of love, let's come together and be united and recognize that in our zealousness, in our own faith, and he's not saying this is a bad thing that you're speaking in tongues, but even in what you just read, but how in our own zealousness for seeking those things that we can inadvertently exclude. And I think what he's asking the church to do, especially in this, is just to step back and just to think, when we do these, when I'm speaking in tongues and I'm overtaken by the Spirit, if there's not somebody here that can help to interpret that and make sure we're all included, then I'm doing it basically for myself at that point. And am I really loving the way that God is calling us to love in community? And I think it is a hard reminder in a way to remind us, do we sometimes do things like that? Do we sometimes inadvertently do something in worship? I often think about it in this way. There's a couple of places that I'll point to that I don't think these are judgments or criticisms, just things to be aware of. I think when we went through and we try to use inclusive language, for example, and even try to make sure that, not everything is not, that we try to be more open in the words that we're choosing. I think the Message does a better job of it in actually using language that seems to be more inclusive versus a kind of a male-oriented language that we have in our English language. Or, when Ethan and I were talking about when we do things in worship, sometimes if you're not familiar, if you've never been to worship, you might not know the Lord's Prayer. If you come and think, I'm thinking from an outsider coming in, you might not know why we sing the doxology. You might not understand the structure of our service and why we have certain things and certain things. And sometimes helping to lead through that is a way, I think you're helping to make it easier for people from an outside perspective coming in. So just having that mind, what would it feel like, as Jeff was saying, to come into this space for the very first time? Would it feel awkward if it's not within my faith tradition? Are there things we can do to help that? I think that's what Paul, as a spirit of love, is just thinking through. If we really want the gospel to reach people, if we really want people to experience, then we also have to think about how open are we doing? How are we doing things to help people along through that space? And to just and we've talked about this through our diversity, our Jedi committee, is one thing that we desire to be diverse, and we desire to have that equity, we desire that inclusivity. But also what you need in that creation of that space is, as we have to be honest with ourselves that we're on that journey for that, so that when people come into the space and they don't see themselves represented in there, it doesn't mean it's not desired. It just may mean we just haven't gotten there yet, right? And so I think that's also part of the honesty and the transparency, the vulnerability we have as a community of faith as well. It's just, how do we do that? And I think it does start with making sure that the words that we're speaking, coming from the pulpit, but the songs that we're singing, the way we interact with one another, all of that works together for our worship towards God and our belief out of our hearts of who we love and how we want to unite. I think at the heart of this, what you read, it seems like what Paul was really aspiring to, It's like, it's easy to get into our divisions. It's easy to get into our spots. And we do that for a variety of reasons. Sometimes we don't even realize we're doing it. And Paul's just reminding us, come back together. Let's come back together and make sure that at the heart of the message is that we're not in divisions, but we're united in that same mind, in that same spirit.
Well, and when you think about it, we're never gonna, as Christians, we're never gonna have unity of thought.
No.
I mean, it's
Well,
always, yeah, but it's always gonna be, I think, you know, I don't think it matters how you're baptized, and you may think you have to be immersed, and I mean, and to me, that's just silly to even argue about it, but some people are set on it, and we, you know, even if you get out of racism or discrimination and stuff like that, we build our own divisions that, you know, Jesus is probably looking and saying, what on earth is wrong with them? You know, but you would think that we could have a unity of who Jesus was, of what he taught us. I mean, love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, it's hard to do. I mean, and I don't always, you know, love some folks, but when I'm aggravated, I hear Jesus and I know that I'm wrong. You know, I know when I'm holding hate in my heart, and I know,
Mhm.
you know, I know that's not right. You know, so I don't understand. I mean, I do, but I don't understand how we can be so messed up on that, you know, to where we fight and we argue, and our churches are built on hate, and you know, and we act like that's okay. You know, when we have these ads on TV that are horrible right now, and we act like that's okay. You know, I'm so grateful for Tim's sermon last Sunday, because it just totally touched my heart, you know, as you talked about what the church should be. And I think, you know, if we're going to be inclusive, if we're going to show love, that's the starting point right there, is to be unified, that love of our neighbor is our goal, you know, and you had an 18-year-old kid commit murder in Buffalo yesterday, racially motivated. So his life was built on hate. And you have to wonder, did he ever get a message of love anywhere that could overcome this? And if our churches keep on being silent or keep on agreeing with this kind of stuff, you know, we're liable to be like Russia, you know, and just go out and kill blacks, kill gays, and kill everybody. So, you know, I don't know. It just, you know, I just think if there's one thing we should be able to agree on, it should be the fact that Jesus told us to love our neighbor.
Preach.
Sorry, I'm in a mental state today. So
No, I think you're so right, Marilyn. And sometimes, you know, if you think about it, some of the things being talked about, I just get exhausted when, and I know, like, I'm just tired of people talking about my sexuality or sexuality in general. You know, that's not, just be quiet. Just keep your opinion to yourself. We should be at a different space than where we are, but we're not. And Rusty asked the question, what prevents us from worship? I think for me, sometimes I can come in and just be really angry. And depending on what's going on during the week, and I have to calm myself down before I get in church, you know, and things that help calm me down are the music, Tim's prayer that he prays, and just all that. But it gets exhausting when, you know, the people that are being talked about, and it's not just me, it's a lot of other people, you know, Black people, gays, transgender. But saying all that, I think it goes back here again to what kind of, I don't know how to say this, but what kind of vibes are we sending out to people in those communities? Whether it's symbols, I was thinking about symbols, you know, the words that we say in our church, what's on our website. We talked about that in the Jedi committee. Like if somebody's looking for a church, if I moved to a different city and I was looking for a church, the first thing I'm gonna want to find out is, okay, what do they think about same-sex marriage? Well, if I saw a website that said marriage between a man and a woman, well, I'm not gonna go to that church. It's not a safe space. But yeah, I think we need to focus on the love more. I think we do at Southside. I mean, I always feel safe there, and I feel encouraged, and I feel, I don't know, being like you're not alone. That's that community piece, that kind of what Tim was talking about. You look out in the crowd and you connect with each other, and you're like, well, the story of this person and that person, and they're going through struggles too, or joy too. So,
Rusty, I was going to say one thing too. All those things that were said are true, but and I think evidence is a sense of safety for a lot of folks, but we can do better. I think it's an obvious that we can do better, and we can. The first step is just being conscious of it.
yeah,
Being aware of that, and that I believe that the Spirit of Christ will speak to us, convict us when those things that are down there somewhere, we don't know where it is, but all of a sudden it leaps to the forefront, and we say, where did that come from? I don't like what I feel when I hear myself even contemplating that. Those are the kind of things I think where the personal change takes place that then is made applicable to situations. So I just wanted to mention that too, but.
Thank you.
Well,
Go ahead. Were you gonna say something, Jeff? But I think this is a great conversation. I think that
mute myself.
is that as we think about what Paul is saying, I think it is all these things, and I think it's going back to the reminder that Carl gave us. It's that spirit of love. It's loving the Lord our God with all of our heart, our soul, and mind, loving our neighbor as ourselves, and it's the embodiment of this. I think when he's writing to the church, or he's recognizing and seeing the spirit, and he knows there's spirits there. I think he knows that, and he's helping to mold them into this place, and reminding them into to really truly love one another, to create that spirit of love. Here are the things that are going to be necessary to do some changes in me. So I think if we were to summarize it, is kind of Paul saying to them, remember who's around you. Participate together, work together towards this, create that oneness. And to your point, Marilyn, I don't think Paul was saying, hey, y'all have to think exactly alike. I think what he was saying was, come together in the Spirit of God, come together with your commitment, your love for one another, and following God's commandment, as Jesus has taught us, and to follow that example and to share that gospel story. And in that, recognizing that each of us has a gift, and when we come into that, creating that space where those gifts can be realized and used, but we share in those things, that there's a willingness to share and to participate and to celebrate. But most importantly, when we come into worship, it's hopefully that we move beyond thinking that this is a performance that we're going to really one in which we are allowing our hearts and our minds and our souls to be directed to the one that's worthy of our worship, and that is before God. And that's where we're here today. I think that's what Paul was trying to do, was to get that alignment back into their lives, so that those divisions would no longer be a distraction, but rather they would be able to come together collectively. So I close us with that we do all have unique gifts that we bring. We come with the spirit of unity. We come with the spirit of inclusion, that when we participate in worship, we move away from that tendency to be the audience member, to an active participant in worship, and that hopefully through that worship, we are uplifted in our walk with Christ. Any other closing comments or thoughts?
Rusty, I think I've just got a quick one just for thinking about making spaces and thinking about the community, thinking about things that are uplifting. This past Thursday, I had the privilege of spending an hour or so planning the Interfaith Pride service that we're putting on in Birmingham. And it's a number of churches. There are a lot of churches that are welcoming and affirming in Birmingham. Some are Christian, some are not, but all coming together for these communities to celebrate that all people are made in the image of God, that all people are welcome, that all people are included. And that it's one of the things in reading this text, talking about the idea of asking ourselves always, is what we're doing building others up? And thinking about that specifically in the context of our Pride service that we're planning in Birmingham. It's thinking, okay, how do we celebrate? How do we point to the fact that all people can be safe in relationship with God, that the mystery of God includes every single person. And that's been, I think those are the times in my life, Rusty, that I'm moved the most. When I hear language or I see in worship something that is maybe even subversive, something that changes just a little bit and make sure that all people are acknowledged, that all people are seen. And then when you look around the room and you see folks that maybe, at least the way that I grew up, had no business being in the same room together. And yet we are together and we're moving in a direction, we're celebrating with one another. And I think there's a beauty to that. And so for one, I would love for our folks to be a part of that. That's happening Thursday evening, June the 2nd at 6 p.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church in West Homewood. I'll send more information out on that, but a way for us to truly just to lift each other up, especially those in our community right now that are being disparaged, those that are being they're already have been pushed to the margins, but for us to show that level of solidarity and mutuality as a church, it would be amazing. So would love to do that with all of you.
Let's close in a word of prayer. Chris, God, we thank you for your love. We pray that we may have hearts of love through your grace, that we may love you more, we may love our neighbor more, learn to love ourselves more. In Christ's name we pray. Thank you. I'll see you in worship soon.
Bye.